Madam Secretary, would you please call the roll?
Thank you. It's 9:30, so I want to note that time. Director Cochrane.
Here.
Director Giudice is absent. Director Grosball is absent. Director Hernandez.
Here.
Director Rodoni.
Here.
Vice Chair Parr is absent. Chair Rabbit is absent. And President Terrio.
Here.
Thank you.
In order to create a quorum for this meeting, I'm going to appoint on a pro tem basis those directors here who are not ordinarily members of this committee to the committee. So put you to work.
So we're adding Director Garbarino, Director Hill.
Here.
Director Snyder.
Here.
And Director Thayer.
Here.
Thank you. And then once again in the room, we have General Manager Dennis Mulligan.
Here.
Joe Wire.
Yes.
Eva Bar-Furbush. Kim Manolius.
Good morning.
Dave Rivera.
Morning, President.
Mona Babalta. And Mike Hoffman.
Here.
And that confirms staff too.
Thank you. The first item on our agenda is ratification of previous actions by the auditor controller. Wally Kajapaya is not here today, but Joe Wire will give us a brief presentation. Mr. Wire.
Thank you very much. Wale is not available to be here today, and he'll be back next month. And in lieu of going through the report, because we do have a long report we're going to be going through shortly, I will summarize his report for you. There are some nice graphs and charts, as always, in his attachment. Essentially, what the point that PFM was making this time was that we are still getting very mixed signals about the future for as far as overall economic activity is concerned. In other words, is there going to be some form of recession coming up? Is there not going to be a recession? He points out several different types of pluses and minuses. There is no, obviously, crystal ball about the future. It is not necessarily more likely today than it was last month that there will be a recession, but there are things moving in that direction. This particular one he concentrated on was consumer spending, which, as you know, drives about 70% of our economy. It's been relatively strong for all through this pandemic time. That consumer spending has been strong, and it continues to be strong, although it's sort of flattened out the last couple of years if you adjust it for inflation. And so that's now getting people potentially a little nervous, but not super nervous. And employment still, as you guys know, remains strong, and that's always a good factor against having a recession. So with that, the portfolio remains well diversified. You see on his at the end of his report, he's got that chart and high grade investments. And with that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Are there questions or comments from the directors for Mr. Wire? Did I hear one from Director Thayer? Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just had a quick question. Overall, how has the investment strategy changed since the pandemic, if at all?
The board, what the authority the board gives PFM is they give them a discretionary authority for PFM to pick our investment strategy. And that was sort of recognizing the expertise they bring to the table. Not that me and my staff aren't nice people, but our expertise is not investing $400 million, and we have other things we need to do. What they have, I would say briefly, they have stuck with the strategy that they always have. They invest in very high grade investments. In other words, the best, the safest investments in both public and private companies or the public sector, a lot in the public sector. And those tend to be, the highest AAA rated things, and they don't take risks. And that strategy has paid off for them for a long time. Their business is made up of public agencies, and public agencies, naturally, you boards are risk averse. The idea of ending up like Orange County 20 years ago is not something anybody ever wants to do. So we're not here to speculate with the public's money. They understand that, and so that's their job. So as you go through rough patches, they tend to just stay with that because that's the safest route. And what happens in a rough time is everybody else jumps on the safe bandwagon, and those investments can actually do quite well. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Wire? Do we have public comment?
Justine, do we have any public comment on the line?
We do not have any public comment for this item.
Great, thank you.
Then we will take a motion to ratify the previous actions by the Auditor Controller.
So moved.
There's a motion and there's a second. You have those, Madam Secretary?
I do.
Then please do a roll call vote.
Great, thank you. Starting with Director Cochran.
Yes.
Director Chudice is absent. Director Groswell is absent. Director Hernandez.
Aye.
Thank you. Director Rodoni.
Aye.
Vice Chair Parr is absent. Chair Rabbit's absent. President Terrio.
Yes.
Thank you. And we have Director Garbarino,
Aye.
Director Hill,
Yes.
Director Snyder,
Aye.
and Director Theory. Aye. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 4 would be authorized budget adjustments and or transfers. They ain't none. So we'll move along to item 5A, which is to authorize the filing of applications for Federal Transit Administration Formula Program and Surface Transportation Program funding for transit capital projects. Commit the necessary local match for the projects and assure completion of the projects. Again, Mr. Wire.
Thank you very much. The item before you is a necessary action that the board takes in order for us to receive federal funding, which in the programs that were just given to you in the reading of the title. The action requires the staff to, allows the staff to apply, to accept, and then of course then to spend up to $3 million in this particular case of federal funds, and also to bring $760,000 out of the district reserves as the necessary match. Federal funds have to be matched, as you folks are aware. Those funds will be used in this particular case for vessel rehab, channel dredging, and ZEB infrastructure design, and that's detailed on page 26 of your report. There's a chart there. These are additional funds. Last year was we were given from MTC the authority to seek a base amount, and then MTC was able to secure more funding, so they divided some of that amongst us in the region, and we got our share, and that's what you're doing now. And we hear from MTC that we may even be back next year with another little bit to add to this piece of funding for these programs, which is obviously very good news for those of us. And these funds are for the period from 21 to 24, to 2021 to 2024. And with that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Wire. Are there any questions for Mr. Wire on this item? I'm not seeing any looking
I'm
around.
getting excited though.
Always excited by getting more money. Is there a public comment, Madam Secretary?
Justin, do you have public comment for this item?
We have no public comment for this item. Thank you.
Thanks for confirming.
Then we do have a motion to authorize as described.
So moved.
There's a motion.
Second.
And a second. On the motion, Madam Secretary, a roll call vote, please.
Thank you. We're voting on item 5A, the first and second. Director Cochran.
Yes.
Director Chudice is absent. Director Groswell is absent. Director Hernandez.
Aye.
Director Rodoni.
Aye.
Vice Chair Parr is absent. Chair Rabbit's absent. President Terrio.
Yes.
Thank you. Moving on to the pro tem members. Director Garbarino.
Aye.
Director Hill.
Yes.
Director Snyder.
Aye.
And Director Thier.
Aye.
Okay, you have 8 ayes.
8 ayes, the motion passes. Next item on the agenda is to receive the independent auditor's engagement letter for the annual financial audit and single audit for the year ending June 30th, 2023, as submitted by Eide Bailey, LLP. And Mr. Wire, you're at it again.
Yes. As you folks are aware, this item was held over from last month because we had an incomplete letter, engagement letter that's been proofed and improved, and now you have a complete engagement letter. As I mentioned last month, this is the engagement letter for your outside annual audit, and it stipulates in it what the audit team is going to do, what they're not going to do, and what responsibilities fall on your management team for us to meet the goals of the audit. They have already begun work on this particular program, this audit. They will do another visit after the end of the fiscal year, which means later this summer, and you will receive the audit at your November finance meeting as part of your annual report. At that time, the auditor will come and you'll be able to ask questions about the audit. He'll discuss the audit. You can ask questions about the audit. With that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Are there questions for Mr. Wire? I'll have a remark, a couple of them actually. One is, the last paragraph now is as lucid as one can hope for from one of these things. However, On page 7 of the letter, 37 of the packet, there is the following statement. We expect to begin our audit on approximately April 24th, 2023. That's now very approximate. And it really makes no difference to the letter, but it's always good to see attention to detail from our auditors. With that, is there any other public comment on this?
Justine, do you have any public commenters for this item?
We have no public comment for this item. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
No public comment. Then we'll look for a motion to approve the letter.
So moved. If I
There's that, and a second. And there's a second. Thank you, both of you. On the motions, Madam Secretary, another roll call vote, please.
Thank you. We're voting on item number 6 with the first and second. Director Cochran.
Yes.
Director Giudice is absent. Director Grosboll is absent. Director Hernandez.
Aye.
Director Rodoni.
Aye.
Vice Chair Farr is absent. Chair Rabbit's absent. President Terrio.
Yes.
Thank you. And moving on to the pro tem members, Director Garbarino. Aye. Director Hill.
Aye.
Director Snyder.
Aye.
And Director Thier.
Aye.
Thank you. 8 ayes.
That's a motion that passes then, 8 ayes. Next item, and Mr. Wire, this is the real reason you're here, is something we're always excited to hear. The initial presentation of the proposed fiscal year 23-24 operating and capital budget and budget book. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, this is the main event for this morning. And we are going to talk about the budget, obviously. And if you have one in paper, is this. There also is one online on the district's website, and that is, they're paged the same, so you can use either. You can either go online or you can use a paper copy, depending on what is your preference. The online is going to be found at the district, under district, on the district website. Then you go under district, you go under the board of directors, under meetings, and then the finance committee meeting of today. And then it's item 7, actually, on that particular list. And it'll come up. It's a pretty good sized document, may take a moment to load, but it is there. And it is, as I said, the page numbers on that are the same page numbers that we use in the document itself. And those are the ones that I will speak to. Some of you have heard this before, you know, I have a tendency, a history of using the actual book. I think it's useful. It allows you to become familiar with it. I think there's also a little bit of due diligence there you're doing for the full board. You can tell anybody and everybody that you have actually looked through the budget book, because we will go through it, not entirely. It is a very detailed document with, you know, several hundred pages. So we will not do that. We will just take a look at the overview of the district's finances, and then of course the budget, the operating and capital budget itself. The goal of today is to do that and to answer any questions you may have. I think it works best if you have ones that are right on the tip of your tongue, just to raise your hand, speak up, or just start talking, because otherwise they can get lost and we cannot get through. If there gets too many, we will stop and the questions, and we'll go back to the presentation.
Raised if somebody wants to talk. And then I'll
Okay. And then the budget will come back to this finance committee for further questions at its June 22nd meeting, which is the next meeting. And then you will be asked at that time to forward or recommend. The recommendation to you at that time will be to forward it on to the full board on June 23rd, which is the last meeting of the fiscal year. So we will have it approved before the beginning of next fiscal year.
I'm going to put you to the test right away. I believe Director Hernandez has a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for the opening to just pop out questions. I did have a question, and in your report and in the booklet, it states that the budget does not include salary increases for 18 represented employees, since those are still under negotiation. I understand there may be some movement there and a development that will be presented later in meetings this week. And I'm wondering, since the salary increases aren't included in the current budget as it stands, how will the budget accommodate for possible increases relative to recent decisions made with the AT?
Yes, we would have gotten to that. but it is one of the items that the board is asked to approve on this report. It's the last recommendation in the recommendation section, and I think it's the first of A, B, C, D, and E. And things A, it says that any action that the board takes between the time that you approve the budget and the end of the fiscal year will be included in the budget before it is finalized by staff. We will include it. So in this particular case, there may be other actions. You may have another board action that causes something to happen. But in this particular case, if the board were to ratify an MOU and the MOU is ratified by the members, then we would then incorporate those expenses into the budget document before it is finalized. So they would be there. The impact of this particular one would be, it would change the overall amount of expenditure. So right now that's around $271 million. It would make that number larger, and we'd have to calculate exactly what that is. In this particular case, because the district does not have extra revenues, of course, we would either be taking from, if there's sufficient monies, we have some ARPA funds left over, that's the federal one-time funding, we would use that. If that runs out, we would have to use money out of the district reserves to fund the budget for this particular year. And that's what we would show that, and we will show that in the final printed version that you will see. It usually comes to you at your August board meeting.
Very much, Mr. Moore. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, can I do a follow-up, and you can include this in your report if you want? Just wondering, most public entities budget full staff, and in relation to that, whether we do that at Golden Gate, and then how you would deal with the bus drivers being down so many bus drivers when you're budgeting for next year.
So I'll take the bus driver one first, because yes, the bus driver, there are a number of vacancies, and there are a number of vacancies across the district. The largest single group of vacancies, of course, are the bus operator vacancies. The district for bus operators is always budgeted based on the amount of work rather than on the number of individuals. And it's just because the nature of their work is driven by the minute, essentially. You pay by the minute. And plus you pay benefits based on the number of hand count. So we fund a particular level of service. And in this budget, it is we're funding the current level of service plus an aspirational amount. In other words, amount to grow. And this, the way we define it in this budget is, right now, we pretty much run all of our regional service, which is the local service on 101 and that side. And we're running about 20% of our commute service. And so this budget says, well, we're going to put enough money in there to run about 60% of our commute service. Whether or not the district actually gets to that depends on the return of its customers. Otherwise, those trips will not be put out. We will not run that service to do that. So that's how that particular part. When it comes to other employees across the district, we fund all the vacancies. That's how we do it. We start each year doing it that way. And you'll notice that if we don't fill those vacancies, then the expenditure for the year is less than it would have been otherwise. And we report that as we go through those. It's your monthly financial report on the Finance Committee.
Please go on.
Okay, thank you very much. So I mentioned when we would come back to you in June to do that. What I will do is I'll take a look at the budget document itself now, and then we'll come back to the board report just to look at the recommendations before we close out. So at least we're clear what recommendations the staff would be asking the Finance Committee to recommend to the board next month. So turning to the budget book, as I said, you can get it online or you can use a hard copy. If you turn to the first page, this is our page to recognize the amount of work that goes into producing a book. And I have to admit, the publishing of a document, I'm much more familiar now with what it takes to crank out an actual book, or a writer, someone who does that. It's pretty amazing. Not just the content, but the actual doing of it is a big job. So what you've got here is a recognition of the folks that work on it. Every department in the district touches this book. Every department has something to do. We talk to them, we work with them, they work with us, they give us information, it goes into here. Some more than others. The people that you see on here, and this includes, most of them are in my staff, are do the heavy lifting. So we have Jennifer Minucci, who's actually here, and Amy Fry from Capital, who is not, and Eric Reeves, who is here and back over there, and Lauren DePashley is not here. She's from Capital Students, and Chris Rogers on my staff, who's not here. They do the real heavy lifting around this book to get it to where it is today. And I also want to point out that in Eric, Lauren, and Chris's, this is their first full budget cycle. So they went through the entire year, and so that's even more impressive to me, to see someone, group that can come together and get it done for the first time, because there is a lot to learn when you're going through it the first time through for the full cycle. And then lastly, to say, look, the amount of work that goes in by your team, the other officers, the DGMs, especially Dennis and the meetings we have with him, it's a big process, and we have a detailed section on that process if you're interested in learning about it, and you can talk to me about it too. So the special thanks to all of them for the work that they put into the book. And we have produced a string of about 15, 16 years of award-winning budgets, and we expect to do that again next year. The certificate for last year, it always comes 6 months late, is in the book on the next page, if you turn to the next page. With that, I'd like to turn your attention to the GM's message, and that's on page 9. And you see a recent photo of Dennis there. The GM's message is I'll just point it out, it is a good place to get facts on sort of what we're facing, what happened last year, some of the accomplishments from last year, and what we're looking forward to next year. And I think I won't read through it, it's just 2.5 pages. I won't read through it here, but please take a look at it. It, along with the status reports, which I'll mention later, which are in the individual budgets, have, if you're a reader, they're the ones that give you sort of in written words the easiest way to grab sort of the main points of what we're facing as a whole district. The whole district is in the GM's report, and then what the individual divisions are doing is in the status sections of bridge, bus, and ferry in the district's chapters, which are in the back of the book. So those pieces, and I know your staff works a good deal on those. So in a nutshell, challenges. Well, the pandemic, as you know, it has affected the travel in the 101 corridor, and I think the key point that Dennis has been, in fact, I think just the other day told us up in Sacramento, is we have 150,000 less people in San Francisco every day. Okay, and it was our job to bring some of those people into San Francisco and to take them home. That was our entire job. In fact, that was our reason we set up in the transit business to begin with, was to do that. In 1969, 70, that's what the state legislature gave us authority to do. So the fact that there's less people there means there's less demand for our service, and there's nothing we can really do about that ourselves individually. It's just the people don't demand our service and great, so we need to adjust to that. And that's sort of what we've been doing, and that's something Dennis has talked about and we'll talk about more. I mean, and I'll go through it a little later in the document, a little more detail on what's happening to our particular business model. And let me go through this. But anyway, it's an excellent summary, and it's important just to take a look at it when you do that. So turning next to page 17, which is the financial overview. This is remind us, in this section, is what is the budget document? It is a point in time. So that means it is what's happening. It sort of stops the clock, says what's happening right now, and what we're going to look at going forward for the next year. As we know, the clock, of course, doesn't stop, so it's already outdated, even the proposed version. But it's a good measure. It's also your document that you can report to the public what you've done and what you're doing. And that's a very important part of being a public agency, is letting folks know what's happening and what's going on. It is a policy document. It lets them know what your policy directives are. It's a staff workload document. It talks about what you're going to fund, in other words, where you're putting your money and what work the staff is going to be working on, both from an operating perspective, service levels, and from a capital perspective, projects that will be done. So that's also in here. So that's an important aspect for this. Well, this particular document is the 4th year in a row now that we have put together a document, a budget based on a very difficult time to predict our consumer demand. And that's unusual for the district. We used to be what I was calling sort of we were the steady cash cow kind of agency. Things kind of worked next year just like they did last year, and we just went along. We had good demand even in recessions, our demand would stay relatively the same by our customers, a little bit changed. That's not the case anymore. We face a new reality. In a nutshell, this budget does assume that the slow recovery we've seen the last 2 years will continue as a slow recovery. That's sort of what it assumes in a nutshell. Nothing's spiking. However, as we talked earlier, it does have the resources in it to allow a much steeper growth if that were to happen, if our customers were to demand that. At the bottom of the page, you'll see that just the detail, it's a $314 million budget. For that table at the bottom, those bullet points, revenues, you've got $216 million in operating revenues, $55 million from ARP funds. So that's about 20% of the budget. On the capital side, there's 18 million coming from government grants and 24 million coming from the district's reserves. And the district, as I'll mention later, of course, district reserves are intended to be used to fund capital projects. The expenses, that's 271 million in operating expenses and another almost 43 million in capital expenses. So that makes up the 314 total. If you turn to page 18. If we look at this, we've got, this covers the discussion that we had, the question that was asked just recently. It goes over this again, so I won't do it, but it was the point here on that top of the page where we talk about what that represents in the budget. What does it mean for service? And that means, move your commute bus service from 20 to 60% and your ferry commute service from like about 60% up to 75%. That's the Larkspur commute service. That's what this budget, the aspirational aspect of this budget funds. So that's what that point. Let's turn to page 20. Page 20 is graphically sort of what we just talked about. Those that works better that way. The important thing I think on page 20 that jumps out at you, the pie chart on the right top and the left top is a table. They represent revenues. You just get a sense of the importance of tolls. Tolls is that large blue chunk, and I think that's very important. The other one here, important to take a look at, is the red pie, which is the ARP money. That's the federal one-time funding money. So that's the money that we're using to fund this budget that we're not producing. We've got that, and that will eventually run out. And we'll talk more about that timing for that later. Lastly, on the revenue side is the small 6% fares, which is the orange slice. You see that used to be about twice the size and should be growing from there, but it is something that's an important funding source that we don't have that we had before, and we'll talk more about that in the operating budget. On the bottom on expenses, I think the important thing to notice there is the very large blue slice, which represents more than half the district expense, is transit operating. So, it's no surprise that is the expensive thing the district does, is operate its transit bus and ferry transit division. It's important to know. On the table on the next page is a lot of numbers. It's the trend. It offers the budget year, which is next year, the current year we're in right now in the middle column, and on the left is last year. And it's a 3-year, so that we can show trends to people. The important thing I'll just point out here is that on the top is sort of the finances, the revenues and expenses, and basically the bottom right-hand corner of that top table, it says it's negative $24.6 million. And what that means is we're going to take that much money out of the reserves to fund this budget. And that was the $24.6 million that we're going to bring out because of the capital projects. And that's the intention. We saved that money in previous years because we know we have to fund capital projects, so we take it out of reserves, put it in the budget to fund those projects. So that's what we've been doing for decades now. The bottom table talks a little about that reserve flow itself. On the far right-hand side is proposed. You'll see at the top of that bottom table is $24.6 million that we've taken out of reserves. This budget also adds money back to the reserves. That's the very important district capital contribution that we talk about. It's money that's raised every year by the operating budget, so it can go into reserves, so then it can be used in the future to keep those capital projects running. And as a capital-intensive agency, if we don't have our capital infrastructure in place, we can't provide the service that we provide. It's essential to us. So in total, there's $33 million going into the reserves. So the net effect of this budget, if everything goes to plan, will be an increase in reserves by $9 million, which is still needed because we have significant capital projects coming down the corridor. Next, page 23. Yes.
On page 21, under revenue, under other, so revenue from actual to estimated actual is more than double. Is that a result of investment income, or what other category would be responsible for that more than doubling? estimated actual?
The single largest would probably be investment income, and that was primarily
investment income. One, that we had rising interest rates, which means our investment income grew, but what really happened was we had negative investment income because when interest rates rise, the bonds that you hold become less valuable. The price of the bond drops. And the GASB rules require us to market on the end of the fiscal year. So even if we're never going to sell the bond for that low price, we're just going to wait and get our income off it so we don't get hurt. We have to actually show in this report what the value of those bonds were on that day if we had sold them, which of course we didn't do, because PFM wouldn't do that because we'd lose a bunch of money and we would be firing them. And they know that. Yeah. So that's the biggest single change. Because of the size of this table, we had to lump everything into 4 lines. It includes other activities also. All right.
Page 23 is the
district reserves available for capital projects. We like to see that line going up and to the right. That means there's more of them each year. We have, as I've been saying for many, many years, the very large capital projects that we have, especially the red side retrofit of the Golden Gate Bridge, the third Phase B phase, which is going to be starting in the next couple of years, will make that line come down significantly. So we have a use for those funds. I think that's what the graph on page 24 is for. If you turn to that one, what that one does, it takes those reserves and it says those reserves are going to be used for something. You're saving them for a reason. And the chart has 2 lines on it, a red line and a blue line. The bottom line is the red line, and that is allocation of the reserves. That's when the board takes an action on its budget or on a particular capital project, and it allocates the resources of that project. So essentially it says, I have $50 million and we're going to spend it on X. The blue line is actually how the money spends out, which is at a much slower rate, because once you allocate the project, of course, then we have to notice proceed, get the project going, and we go through a spending. So that blue line is the slower line. The important thing to note is both of them cross the dark line in the middle of the graph, which is the 0 line. So both of them go negative. And what we do during the financial planning process is we make sure we're raising sufficient money as the years go forward to keep those lines from ever actually crossing negative. In other words, we keep them positive, and we have successfully for several decades kept them positive going forward by raising additional monies each year. This is just showing what would happen if, essentially we stopped and we didn't do what we were supposed to do, which is continue to balance our budget and continue to produce positive income. Yes.
This downward slope due to the retrofit project? Is that
the steepness of it, the large jump? Yes.
That doesn't take into account the 400 million that we'll be getting at some point.
The actual
it takes the total cost of the budget and sort of averages out over a period of time. So it doesn't quite represent the red line, of course, is allocation. The blue line doesn't quite represent what will happen with actual spending, because we don't really know exactly how actual spending will go. It's our best guess at the time when we put this together. But it graphically shows that when you do the size of retrofit, you're going to allocate a huge chunk, close to 200 million or something, just right from the get-go, even though you have hundreds of millions of dollars of grant funds also, but we have to match that with our 20%.
More than 400 million for the retrofit too.
Right, so it's 877 million. Joe's staff, as part of their projections, makes an assumption we're going to get so much grant money. So it's baked in, we have the 400 million. This is basically showing the match.
Right.
This is the match.
And so there's some assumptions there that are very open as we speak, that Joe and I were just talking about before this meeting, dealing with things in Sacramento and some of our sponsors in the legislature.
It was for better or for worse, many years ago, the district sort of we made the decision that we would assume that the seismic retrofit would be funded 80% by somebody else's money, state and federal, and 20% by us. We made that assumption. So these graphs have always represented just our 20%. And when we bring the projections to you each year, which is in the October timeframe, in the back of that projection is sort of a discussion about, well, if it doesn't happen, let's say 80-20 doesn't happen and ends up being 50-50, then what does this graph look like? And we show it at that point. Did we put that in the appendix?
And we're seeking 250 million to get us to the 80%.
That report's actually in the appendix of this document. I was just checking it out. Okay, thanks.
Are there other directors, since we've paused for questions, who have more for Mr. Warren? Please continue.
Okay, thank you.
Page
Page 26 then. These are some familiar graphs to you now, especially the Finance Committee sees them month to month. They are powerful though, and I think what is important about these is they bring home the change in our operating world, what we operate in. We are an agency that was set up in order to fund ourselves with our own fees. So we charge a toll or a fare. We use those monies to provide the services. And so if the customers pay less or use our service less, we bring in less revenue. We'll first look, the first two, if you're looking at it, page 26 and 27 are bridge. The first one being the traffic patterns, the second one being the revenues those traffic bring in. And essentially all we're pointing out in the budget document here is to let you know that the budget itself is assuming, and it will follow the same on all 6 graphs, but we'll look at this first one on page 26, is that the budget is assuming that its progression of traffic will be just slightly higher than last year. And that's the yellow line on your graph, which is 2022 traffic. So you can see the year already starting, which is the purple that's right behind the yellow. We expect that the purple for 2023 to be somewhat similar to the yellow, just slightly above the last one. And that's how the traffic is projected for this particular year. If you turn the page to page 27 with revenue, the revenue is also going to be just slightly higher than the last year. In fact, toll revenue is we're expecting to be a couple percentage points greater than last year based on slightly larger traffic and, of course, a higher toll rate that we will be charging as part of the last year of our toll increase program. So, and the last toll goes in of our previous 5-year program goes in this July 1st. So if you can see that we are above last year, which is good. What these graphs are showing is the first COVID year is the red one, which is at the bottom, which was obviously very bad for business. But the top line in these 2 graphs, the blue line, that's pre-pandemic. And so although we are increased, we are not near pre-pandemic. We're still about 20 percentage points away from pre-pandemic rates times. And that's something we just have to plan for as we go forward. And if this year ends up as projected, roughly a little bit more than last year, we've really got 3 years, that'll be 3 years in a row of relatively steady business. A little bit higher, but relatively steady. No large and significant changes. Next, let's turn to page 28. And then page 28 and 29 are the same 2 graphs, but for the bus division. They look a little different, of course. Bus ridership, we expect, as you can see on ridership is on page 28. You can see, of course, the blue line, which is pre-COVID, very high, and then the red line, very much at the bottom, which was the COVID year. But each year after, the green and yellow are 21 and 22. Growing, and we expect 23 to be slightly above 22. Maybe not quite as high as the difference between 21 and 22, but still above 22. And if you look over at the next page on page 29, revenues would do approximately the same thing. They'll be slightly higher. However, both of these you can see are less than half of where we were in pre-pandemic time. And we're expecting that from a revenue perspective, it will stay in that range, less than half of the pre-pandemic time. Lastly, looking at page 30 and 31 are the ferry division. Similar graph to bus, very significant difference between COVID and the post-COVID and the pre-COVID time period. We expect that the purple line, which is 2023, will stay again above 2022, the yellow line. It will follow the similar seasonality. Ferry has a very large seasonality because of, especially the ballpark, but now Angel Island and the ballpark, both, and Sausalito, all three of those have much larger traffic numbers, of course, in the summertime. And so you see that kind of spike, that mound in the middle, the summer months. So we expect that to continue to be slightly higher than last year, but of course not reach about half the heights of where we were pre-pandemic. So in these last pages, we've been looking at how things are slightly better, but they are not where we used to be.
And I think that's just the important thing.
And
the thing I want to point out is
they are being consistent. And as if you're doing a projection or you're talking about a budget which is talking about the future, consistency is important. So if you start to see a consistent pattern, the odds are that consistent pattern is going to roll forward another year. So I think that's what we all should be thinking, that it's not just magically going to change. Human behavior is unusual. Humans do strange things. It could change, but it's not likely to change, not dramatically quickly in that way. Yes.
I have a question for a point. And I probably should have noticed this like ages ago. But the interesting thing, one of the interesting things about these graphs is that because the revenue graphs are corrected so that they reflect the tolls or the fares at the current rate. Even though the identifier of the y-axis changes, the graphs have pretty much exactly the same shape as the traffic and passenger graphs too. I'm left to wonder what they would look like if we saw an uncorrected graph, and it might be interesting to see that sometime.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I did not put that on directly, and I'm glad you pointed out. Every graph you've seen prior to this at your budget meetings are the uncorrected. These are the first ones that have been corrected. I've made them struggle to correct them because my interest to you as your financial support is to make sure you realize that the buying power of what you're getting today. So what was happening was, say in Bridge, the money we were earning was getting closer and closer to what we used to earn in 2019, even though we had 20% less traffic, because we had raised the price 4 times. And as we kept raising the price, the money we earned on 80% of the traffic was getting close to what we used to earn on 100% of the traffic 4 years before. The problem was we actually needed, if we're going to keep our transit division running as we wanted to and our bus division running, we actually needed the 100% of the traffic we had the year before and have the price rise off that, a much higher rate of growth. Not higher rate of growth, it would a higher absolute amount of funds. So this shows the absolute amount of money that we would have earned if we kept our old traffic levels but had today's prices. And this is much closer, this blue lines you're seeing on these graphs are much closer to the money you would actually need if you wanted to run pre-pandemic levels of service. That's sort of the purpose of this. Haven't decided what we're going to do with the actual reports. Next month's status report, there isn't a status report this month because the board meeting was so early this month, we were not able to get the financial reports together to have one. That's why you see at the end of this agenda, there isn't the usual reports. If they were in here, they would be the ones that you're familiar with that were not changed for the same pricing. No, there isn't a reason we couldn't include both versions. In fact, we could do that. We can absolutely do that. We could do that in the next status report, and you can get a look to see them and see what it looks like.
I'll do that anyway.
Okay, we'll take a look. The next thing we're going to look at is page 32, and this is a new graph we've stuck in this year also. And if it's the bottom of page 32 is sort of where the rubber meets the road at the district, financial-wise. What this represents is bridge revenue over expenses. And what that means is the money the bridge earns and the money it needs to spend to keep its operations going, what's left over is the money that the district has had over the years in order to reinvest into transit. So if you look at that graph that's on the bottom of page 32, you can see that it starts out on the far left on year 13, 14. So let's say 2014, and then it gets up to about 2019, pre-pandemic. And there's a sort of gradual up and down, but upward upward movement there on that graph. And that's the important thing to see. It's the amount of subsidy is growing a little bit each year. That allows us to fund transit. It allows us to have costs go up in transit, you know, benefits, salaries, fuel, things of that nature. So that keeps our operation ticking right along. Then COVID came and it went right down, and then a couple of years lower, and now it's sort of gradually going back up again. The important thing to note is, of course, we have less subsidy today to subsidize transit. Even if we wanted to run more transit, we don't have the money to do it in that sense. And an important thing is the point we were just talking about is if bridge subsidy had the revenues over expenses, the availability of bridge subsidy had continued to grow following the pattern from 14 to 19, the amount that it would actually be able to raise now, the subsidy that would be available today would be over $90 million, not $59 million, but over $90 million. And if we were to run pre-pandemic level service, we would need the $90 million or close to it in order to do that, to run that. So even though we are producing, the district is producing revenue from the bridge that it will be able to use to subsidize transit. So that is still happening. That model still works. It just isn't at the same levels as it used to be. And that's just an important thing to know. Whether it'll ever return to those levels, we don't know. It depends on the traffic on the bridge coming through. And then the same thing, the next, if you turn to page 33, there's a short discussion about fare revenue. It's, you know, the second largest source of subsidy for the transit divisions prior to the pre-pandemic. It's down about 50%, a little more, maybe 55% down from where it used to be. So those two sources alone are off, say, 50 million from where they were several years ago. And that gets at what I think Dennis keeps sending out every week to you folks in your weekly letter, $1 million a week, roughly. It's, you know, we're in that ballpark. We have that much less to work with than we would have had at a prior time. And how we've been surviving with that is on page 35. Yes, on page 35. That's a table that talks about the ARP funding. We are extremely fortunate, the district, as you guys are very well aware of, $287.9 or almost $288 million provided to us by the good folks of the United States of America in order for us to run public transit here in Marin, Sonoma, and San Francisco. And we have used a quite percentage of those revenues already. The table that you see in front of you, starting from the left, is the first year of pandemic to 2020, and then 2021, 2022, as you go to your right, 2023. The middle band has the actual act that was passed and the amount of money that the district has spent out of that act's funding. As you go across that middle band to the far right in bold is the total amount we got from each one of those acts, and it totals to $287.8 million or $9 million there at the bottom on the far right. And if you look under the column for the budget year, which is the third from the right, that's the proposed budget year. It just shows our, you know, at the top, our revenues, our expenses, and then the $55 million difference between the two. And then if you go down the middle, it shows that we're going to use $55 million from ARP3, which is great, to balance the budget. And then it also shows that just to the right of that $55 million, that we're going to have about $5 million left. So of that $288 million at the end of this next fiscal year, if everything were to happen as this budget is printed, we would have $5 million in ARP funds left. If we spend less than the budget is, which is what the question was asked earlier, is our expectation is that our customers won't all come rushing back this one year, and that we probably will spend less, and then we will return the budget money. The money will not leave the reserves, that there likely will be more than $5 million left. How much more depends on how much less we spend than the budget is set up. This particular year, the year we're in right now, we'll spend tens of millions less than we would, and that projection will come to you shortly. So, we are underspending our budget because our customers have not been returning as we planned that they might. The last thing, the important thing that this table does is the very bottom line of this table is something called the cumulative toll revenue carryover. These are toll revenues that the district now has in its reserves. These are funds that came out of the operating budget and that we were transferred to reserves because the district did not spend them on operating subsidy. And the reason it didn't spend them on operating subsidy is because it got the ARPA funds and the CARISA funds and the CARES Act funds. Otherwise, because those laws allowed the district to charge, in this particular case, salaries and benefits of its transit workforce to these acts. And because of that, there are some subsidy amounts that were available that were not spent, and so they were put in the reserve. And we're calling that the total revenue carryover. It isn't an actual reserve that's been set up by the district. It's in your reserves, and we're following that as an amount. The monies are the boards, at the board's discretion. You can spend them on whatever you choose to. That could either be continuing transit service. It can be soft landing for transit as you transition transit service. It can be on capital projects, anything you want. It's total revenue. But it was earned because of that.
It's spent on transit, and so we kind of banked it, thinking that someday the board may choose to spend it on transit so that we have a much longer runway. So in addition to not spending all the budgeted money next year if our customers don't come back, we'd have some leftover ARP money, plus we would have this total carryover to extend our glide path out, which is important because things are slowly coming back. We'll get a better sense of what the future looks like. And if we have more time to let enough customers come back so that we can kind of make things work at whatever, new thing we look like, it'll be very beneficial.
Yes, go ahead, please.
That's a very good analogy, that glide path. As we all get calls, I don't get as many as some, about extending service back to where it once was. This is very prudent, that glide path.
So if our customers start to come back, we will continue to add service, bus and ferry, as they come back. We'll do it like we have been, though. We don't want to run empty buses. That's bad for the environment. It's bad for our bottom line. But if we keep doing that plus the federal money we got from the ARP, especially that third round nationwide competition, less than 3 dozen transit agencies got money. We had 75 million, plus the total carryover buys us many years to sort out what our agency will look like in the future. So we're not in a panic mode. We are in a fiscally prudent mode, being responsive to our customers.
Yeah, I think as Dennis said, even if we look at last year as a model, well, the current year we're in right now, we're in June, I'm in May, we're almost to June. We're at the end of our current year. If next year's business, bus and ferry, bridge is roughly similar to this year, a little slightly better. In other words, what we talked about, if that's what happens, there's a good chance that even the ARPA funds, we won't spend the full 55 million this year. We'll spend something less, 30 million, something like that. That 25 million will slide over into next year, and we'll probably make 2 years with the ARPA funds. I mean, I think given the last 2 years of our business, or 3 years now, that's a safe statement to make. We don't know if it's going to happen because you may get a large demand for your service starting next fall for some reason that we can't predict, and then the subsidy will be needed and the ARPA money will spend faster. But if it spends more like the last couple of years, we would expect that the ARPA alone 2 years, and then as Dennis mentioned, there's a glide path after that, with the boards has the discretion to spend its own total revenue carryover money on what it chooses to.
And just an observation, in the next few years, next probably 5 to 10 years, we're going to be heavily invested in electrification, for example, and new fleets and costs associated with it. Does this take into that effect at all in the consideration? With what you just said was kind of assuming the continuation of the like it is now, but are we going to have that?
So the mandate to green the fleet is coming from the state.
I wasn't referring to the capital. I'm sorry, I should have qualified.
Because this is capital.
Yeah.
So we anticipate when Joe gets to the capital budget, we anticipate we're going to get capital funds for a percentage of things. We anticipate we'll need a match. We anticipate through our setting money aside every year that we'll have adequate match. Every year they relook at that. And so there's an opportunity to adjust as we go forward. But it is a fact that cost of electrification is on par with our seismic retrofit costs have been.
And I think one of the things that the groups that the district and especially Dennis has been a part of is regional activities amongst the GMs that's taken place since the pandemic. You know, they get together. There's several different committees that they're on. One of the outcomes of one of the groups is the idea of banding together as a region when it comes to electrification and seeking resources as a region. And Amy and my staff on the grant side is, of course, a part of that group. And I'm definitely optimistic on that one now. I mean, that group really does seem like they're going to work. That seems like an idea that's got a lot of ground. I mean, Dennis is nodding to it. His colleagues feel the same way. People I talk to feel the same way, because we all face that huge burden coming up. This electrification is cost, and if we go the road together, we have a much better chance of getting the grant funding we need. We still have to come up with a match, as Dennis said, but we have a much better chance of getting the grant funding we need to actually do the electrification projects. So, as a group, than fighting amongst ourselves.
There are a lot of items ahead under the capital discussion concerning electrification. Maybe if you flag those as we chew through there, Joe, that'd be good.
If I could add one last thing, sadly, capital money is easier to get than operating money. So if we need to get money for electrification, if we need to get money for seismic, the opportunities historically have been much greater for capital projects than it has been for operating. And so hence the focus on the operations is it is the tougher problem to solve. It's important that you have an understanding of what the glide path looks like and what the policy ramifications of that are. Because for whatever reason, right or wrong, society funds shiny new objects much more so than they fund people.
Anyone else with a question?
No,
Excuse me, question.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's what we do.
All right, Joe, go ahead.
Okay, if we just turn to page 36 for just one last look at transit funding. This is the traditional table and graph 36 and 37 that we published that talks about how Golden Gate Transit is funded and what we expect how it'll be funded next year. And I think that just an important thing to look at here is it gets at a little bit what I was saying is the table on 36 on the left-hand side is how it was funded we believe it will be funded in this current fiscal year that we're ending now. And the two lines at the bottom of the table show that about 43% of the funding for this year's transit system is coming from the ARP. And we budgeted next year, which is the table, the right-hand side of the table, that ARP funding will be 33% of the total transit budget. And the reason for that is that bridge revenues and bridge subsidies you saw has grown. That was the red chart we looked at 3 or 4 pages ago. That's grown, and so the bridges are going to be able to handle about 33% of the expenses, and that reduces our need for ARP funding. Now, if we run even less service or less service than budgeted, then we'll use even less ARP funding. So that gives us hope that we're headed, in that right direction of producing more of the necessary subsidy ourselves. All right, with that, we'll turn on to page 39.
No, that's okay, and I can make the comment later. It just struck me, one of my favorite sayings is there's a lot of bleeding on the cutting edge. And what you said about everyone joining arms and going forward together will also, I believe, help the legislature understand that as we green the fleet, that's another great term, that as capacity is an issue, and I'm not trying to put a wet blanket at all on any of the greening of the fleet, because we're doing the same thing and it's the right thing to do for generations to come. But I really like that approach. It's far more conservative. As a public agency, you need to do that. I know a lot of private entities, large ones actually in my industry, have leapt forward and they're bleeding on that cutting edge. So I like the approach. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
Anyone else? Joe.
Okay, page 39, if we turn to that page, the reason for that is if you saw, we're still using about 33% of our funding, and we know that that's got a year or two left, and then of course we won't have any, so we'll need to have moved on to a time where we can support our own service levels. And how do we do that? That's your long-term strategic planning, and essentially all this paragraph says is that the board is in the process of doing that, and this calendar year expects to have a completed strategic financial plan. Okay, with that, that's the financial discussion, and we were going to turn on to page 49, which is to take a look at your operating budget and capital budget. Page 49, very simple table and graph. And the intent of that is just, again, to draw your attention to the large blue slice on the right, which is the fund, which is where our money comes from to operate the district, and that's tolls. And this is for you and the public, of course, to understand that toll revenue is essential. It's, over 50% of the revenue that we use. And then the other thing to point out is fares is approximately 7%. There's the orange, which is in this case, in this particular one, comes across as the orange slice, and then the federal one-time funding, which I pointed out earlier on a pie chart, the large 20%. And the bottom graph is the bridge, bus, and ferry division and their respective slices, and you can see that bus and ferry alone makes up over 60% of your operating budget. And as I say, the saying goes, if you are sort of what you eat, then you are a transit division. You're a transit company that owns and operates a bridge, which pays for the transit. So it's a unique dance. Turn to page 50.
I didn't mean to slow us
Yeah.
down, but the toll, this 54% is the toll percentage for 23-24. And I may have skipped over it. What was it in 18, 19?
It was slightly higher,
Uh-huh.
but closer to 60, but not much higher, because what fares made up a larger chunk.
Fares were more than double than they are today. And so their percentage was probably, instead of 7, would be 14, 15, 16%, something more like that.
I get asked that question a lot, and why aren't there more ferries? So this helps.
In our case right now, it's just we don't have the passenger load and
Right.
that we used to have in that sense.
And straight from a fare perspective, the customers that we are not serving today, we're paying 2 and 3 times more per ride than the customers we are serving today, because we're serving more local, not local passengers per se, but more local rides. We're not doing the commute service, which was a much higher price ticket. And the same for ferry especially. We have fewer ferry passengers. Turn to page 50, table on top of page 50. That one is something we just talked about previously. It just points out these are the revenues and expenses, first revenues then expenses, and the years, the 3 years plus the budget year from this year. The right-hand side is our budget. It shows the $55 million deficit. The important thing to show here is the progression. And I mentioned that a little bit, but you can see it here in black and white. If you look at the bold line, which is the third line down, on the far left-hand side, that first number, 37 million, that was the actual revenues over expenses, revenues under expenses, essentially. We had $37 million left. If you go to your right, the next year's budget, we thought our deficit would be 75 million. If you go one more column to what our year, we think this year will actually end at, is close to 21 million. In other words, our actual budget is going to be 50 million less, the deficit's 50 million less than what we thought it was going to be. And the 20 million deficit for this particular year is much, much better than the $37 million deficit for last particular year. So we've improved. And I mean, I know it's kind of, going from an F to a D or whatever, but, we've improved. We're less negative than we used to be. And that is a very positive statement. It's a very significant improvement. Now, also, last year's budget had a $75 million deficit. This year's budget has a $55 million deficit. That's also improving. It's going in the right direction. And, it'd be nice if we're going in that direction faster, but it's moving in that direction. So what we're hoping for is that, the 37 million deficit from last year, the $20 million deficit for this year, which is estimated, of course, it's going to be something different than that when it actually happens. Both, that's a good improvement. If we can see some similar or some kind of improvement to next year, so we don't have a $55 million deficit that we project, something significantly less, that will, of course, make the ARPA funds run that much longer, another year, another 2 years. We got our fingers crossed for that. The bar charts on the bottom, important because the orange and green set of bars, those are 4 different years. Those are your revenues. Orange is your tolls. It just graphically shows you tolls are the biggest chunk, year after year after year after year. The dark green, that's, in this case, the new money. That's the ARPA, that's the money from the federal government that we need to make go away eventually. And our other revenues we need to grow to fill that gap. The blue, red, gray is expenses, and blue are people. That's our staff, all of us. Salaries and benefits, and of course that's by far the largest chunk. And then the red, you get into professional services and other professional types of things like taxes and insurance. But the key is just to focus that we spend a large chunk of our budget on our staff, which is not surprising. We are a service business, and that's what it's expected of our operating budget, of course. Next page. Talk just quickly. I mentioned this when I was looking at those graphs that the 5-year graphs that show pre-COVID and pre-COVID. We talked a little bit about revenues. Just want to say these are your assumptions for your revenues. If you want more information on any of them, we'll just look at a couple of them. That bridge tolls, we expect slight growth in traffic, up about $2 million from last year. So not a huge increase. Hopefully it'll be greater than that. Transit fares, again, a small increase in ridership. We have a new 5-year fare increase plan. So we have a small increase in fares, in price of fares. So we expect about $1.5 million increase in fare revenue over the previous year. And the last area where we're seeing an increase this year is in the state operating assistance. And primarily that was because the previous year, which was last year, we had a $5 million decrease where we did a trade with the MTC, all of us providers did a trade with MTC in order to receive our last tranche of ARPA funding. They had to they needed to have funds. They needed to apportion funds at a certain time rate, and so to do that, they needed to swap some of our STA money for money they needed, and we ended up getting the 70. Eventually, it worked out great for us because we ended up being able to apply and then receive the $75 million. So anyway, the fact that we were down last year makes this year look like a large increase. It's a smaller increase, but there is an increase nonetheless. And so you'll see that change. The next couple of pages have 2 or 3 pages on details about various revenue categories. I won't go in those today, but you sort of look at them. We will move on to page 54. And that's the expenses. Another straight up table. The point I just want to make here is you'll see a very large increase in expenses. And we've talked about it verbally, but just this is where you see the numbers on the page. This year's budget is has an expense of $271 million. That's at almost 19% increase over what we actually spent last year. Not what we budgeted last year, but what we actually spent last year. And the reason for that is what we've been calling internally is the aspirational budget. It allows the district to expand its transit service if its customers were to come back. So we're refunding people essentially in this budget that we would need if we were to need to grow our service. So the revenues, the expense authority have been provided by the board to staff to do that if it needs to do that, if the customers return. Also, I was going to point out the first bullet point on the page was the question that was asked earlier about the ATU. Yes, this budget does not include their any change in their contract. If that were to be settled, which it looks like it might be, prior to the end of the fiscal year, then those expenses would be added to this particular budget. And then to explain, if you turn to page 56, there is a table on page 56 that explains the change, the almost 19% change from last year's actuals, which are estimated, to the budget. And you can see that table in the middle, those numbers in the middle column add up to the 18.9 or 19% increase. The 14.4, the first 2 categories, are over 75% of the change, and that is just refunding the salaries and benefits. And those are essentially the people that are vacant today because we don't have the need to provide that service because our customers aren't demanding it, to what we would need if we were to refund them. And that explains that difference. The next pages are a series of your major expenses and details on those. One of them was a question asked today. The third point discusses OPEB, and that was asked to me not on mic, but off mic. And yes, OPEB expenses are less. The actuary, the district has done a job through its OPEB trust of raising revenues over the years, and the actuary sets our necessary contribution, and that has dropped because of the significant increase in the value of the OPEB trust. And OPEB pays for your retiree health care that you offer your employees. There's also a detailed discussion on the last section here on your various pension health benefits on Section 4, and Section 8 is on pension contributions. And with that, let's turn to page 63 to take a look at the table of organization. As always, we talk a little bit about the table of organization, and it's in detail in each of your budget, your 4 division chapters. It has all the detail of the table organization, the positions that the district has. This is just a summary table on the top of the page, and it talks about if there are any increases or decreases within this particular budget. In this case, there are increases, 7 increases and 1 change in classification. And I want to talk a little bit about these 7 increases. 6 of them are to do with workload, and 1 of them is to do with succession planning. So if you look at that list that's on the bottom of the page, the first one is the succession planning. We have a single proprietor, so to speak, who runs our real estate and property development office. She has been past her time of retirement for a decade, and excellent employee, but works solely on her own and knows her stuff. So in order to transfer that knowledge to a new employee, we need to hire some new person, get them in there working with her before she retires. And it's not going to happen right away, but it will happen. When she does retire, then there won't be 2, there'll be 1 position. We would eliminate the position once she retires. So that's the first succession planning opportunity there. The next series of employees are to do with workload. We discussed this, the seismic retrofit phase 3B is coming. We got the $400 million. We're seeking another $250 from the state. There needs to be engineers and document control specialists brought in to work on that project. And so this is a request for 2 engineers, 2 document control specialists to get that process started. The next one down is assistant payroll manager. We have an extremely complicated payroll. We have essentially, it's like running 26 or 27 different companies because of all the different bargaining things we have. We decided a couple of years ago as staff to move gradually one of our existing payroll employees over to IT because of her skill development. And we were hoping that we could run the operation on 1 less employee, and we have found that we cannot. We are running up a lot of overtime. I'm taking employees from other parts of the organization and putting them in payroll in order to get the payroll done. And as I like to explain it, for those of you who remember Lucille Ball, it's when she's standing in front of that chocolate factory and those chocolates just running out and she's trying to put them into the box and he can't do it. She's putting them in the box. That's what payroll does. 2 cycles every 2 weeks. They're constantly racing the clock, and you can never be gone, because people don't get paid if you're gone. So we have to always backfill it. It's a position we're backfilling either with overtime or others. So this position would help us go back to where we were 2 years ago before we transferred our employee out, which is working great over in IT. We needed the person in IT. So it's not like we didn't need the person there, but we actually need the person in payroll too. So that request is what that is. Then lastly, on the next page, which is page 64, there's the request for a ferry mechanic. Essentially, the important thing to recognize here is we go through cycles in the ferry division. You have brand new ferries, you have ferries that get older, they require more work than the vessels themselves. But even more importantly, in our particular case, the same thing also happens in facilities. And the mechanics can work on both. And we have a lot of mechanical things about our facilities. So this particular need is that our aging facilities and our aging infrastructure need more support. And that's the request for ferry mechanic. And also in the ferry division is the reclassification. We've had a employee acting in an acting position for almost a year, I think close to a year in this acting position. And we've come to you to make that official and move that person into that position, to reclassify their position to be the level of that acting position, to do the work that's necessary, the program manager work that's necessary. And with that, we were going to take, yes.
Are there any questions?
Just another comment. The
Please.
coffee has kicked in. I'm just grateful that there is succession planning. That's critical. And it sounds like you're doing a lot of by design or not design cross-training. I'm just grateful that there's no one in this room that we're doing succession planning for at this moment, because I got a little nervous when you mentioned the topic. So thank you.
And Dennis and I were commenting back and forth that we are happy that the complexities of our payroll have not led to what the complexities of the San Francisco Unified School District's payroll.
Yeah, both, yeah.
It's all around us,
us,
people are having trouble with their payroll in
in
the
the
public sector.
sector.
It's not something you want to do. No, you're
You're
absolutely right.
Oh, it's just on the bus. Are those all current for the 408? Does that include is that asked?
The bus division,
Yeah.
these are what
it's important that these are authorized positions. So you're authorizing the district to hire these people. Doesn't mean these are filled.
Down about 100 bus operators today. And
Yeah.
what this does is it gives us the flexibility to hire the 100 if our customers come back.
Okay.
We just
Yeah.
graduated class of 7. We're starting another class. We're in a hiring mode. We'll need to ramp it up if our customers start coming back. But this way we have the authority to bring on bus operators. But we're not going to hire 100 if the customers don't come back. We'll hire 20-ish.
So it's budgeted.
But it's budgeted. So we have the latitude. You're basically giving us the flexibility to be nimble and responsive to when our customers come back on bus and ferry. The rest of the organization is static. But that's the one area where through the budget and through the delegated authority to me through next March to add service, that if all of a sudden we have a lot more people showing up in Mill Valley, we can add a couple trips, assuming we can hire the bus operators. And so Mona presented last month to the Rules Committee about the innovative programs in partnership with AT Local 1575 and the community colleges for apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships. So we're trying to feed the pipeline because we need to hire. How many we need to hire is an open question based on uncertainty, but we want to have the ability to do it rapidly if our customers come back rapidly.
And at the end of the fiscal year, those 100, that money that we budgeted, that goes back into the glide path.
That goes back in the glide path. So
budget.
Joe talked about how like the current
As
fiscal
you
year,
said.
you know, we're only going to need 20 million of the ARPA as opposed to 50 million.
Okay.
And so that this year we didn't bring on all the ferry and bus staff that we would have if the customers came back. And so we want to have the flexibility to be responsive, but we want to have full disclosure with all you. We're not
the same as the ferries. Like we're not at 105 now. We're at.
I know the ferry, we added service during the pandemic to take advantage of recreational opportunities on Angel Island and Tiburon. But what the budget has aspirationally is basically $1 million for ferry crews for Larkspur to add basically another boat wherever it's needed for crew and fuel.
Anyone else while we're in this questioning mode? No. Mr. Wire.
Thank you. If you could turn to page 65, and we'll do a short look at the capital budget. So we have a page 65. You got a summary, and there are a couple actions that the board we will request the board to make a part of the capital budget that we'll go over when we get back to the board item, and I'll cover those here also. Again, similar to the operating budget, the capital budget is put together with a series of meetings from all of your staff and department heads over the couple months at the beginning of each calendar year. But in addition to that, which is different than the operating budget, the capital budget is actually something that's worked on for years and years and years. And by the time you get to a project gets into the budget, it might have been in the capital plan for a number of years. It might have been discussed at many meetings over a period of years as it kind of gets formatted and reformed and finally, boom, pops out into the budget, and we ask for resources for that. So that's something that goes into this process. This particular year, $42.9 million budget. It involves 65 projects. 18 are new, and that means new to the budget, and 47 are continuing. They were in previous budgets and they're being continued into this budget. That's relatively normal for the district to have that ratio, sometimes even more continuing and fewer new. It depends. Most capital budget projects are multiple years. That's the nature of a capital project for the most part. In this case, the bridge, and there's some charts on the next page which go through this. But in this case, the bridge accounts for about over 70% of the spending, which is also not unusual. But if there's not a bus buy or a ferry purchase or something, otherwise the bridge is the largest part of our capital program. And the bulk of that bridge spending, of course, is in the Size and Rexburg project, which is the largest project we have going in the district right now to do that. There, as I mentioned, there are a couple of actions that we'll be asking the board to take, and I'll go over to two of them now. The first one is the budget proposes to increase the budget in 5 particular projects. These are relatively small. If it's a major project, we just have the operation come to the board at its usual B&O meeting, and we talk about the budget for that particular project at that time. But in particular cases, if they're small enough, or if the project has already been in the budget and its scope hasn't started and the scope has changed, we do it through this way. The 5 total change about $785,000, for all 5 projects combined. And those are, I'll just go through real quickly. The first one is we're doing some office improvement work, which is the break room and the kitchens and a couple of the bus facilities because they're getting run down. And that ended up being $90,000 more than we expected it to be when they started out on the project. So the scope slightly changed, the cost slightly changed. So that one's being requested of the board to make that change in the budget document. Next, on the next page was page 66. Number 2 is bird netting they're putting on the facility. Okay, we haven't started that project. It was rescoped. It cost $20,000 more than we thought it did. So that request is being made. That was in last year's budget. The next one is the on-site medical trailer, which is at D1, which is our Santerfell bus facility. The success of that program has been rescoped. We've started this, but not really started this project. It was in the previous budget, and the trailer and the design needs to be larger to accommodate a more ability to provide more services to our employees on site to keep them from having to go off site for those. So the request is to procure a larger trailer. So that increase is more substantial from $250,000 to $675,000 for that particular project. The 4th project is a CAD-AVL Clipper integration program, which we started. And we have almost completed, and the project took slightly longer and staff than we expected, so the staff time is greater. So they're asking for we're asking for a $50,000 budget increase on $1 million project, essentially, to fund fully that staff time and charge it to the project. And then lastly is the project we rescoped to expand the scope. We haven't really started, which is the ferry fleet and infrastructure electrification concept design. The design has changed, and so the budget of that one is going to go up by $200,000. So those 5 projects are included here, and they will be part of the actions that are asked of the board. The second action asked of the board is page 71, and this is something we do each year. As you know, we set the capital budget and the number of projects, the 65 projects, based on what we think staff will be able to work on during that year. And there are always the possibility that there is an opportunity for staff to complete a project and start another. And so we've created something we call the project list, started doing this about a decade ago. And every year, maybe 1 or 2 of these projects will get lifted off the list by the general manager, and the district staff is ready to start it, and they'll be able to jump in instead of waiting until next year or going to the board to do that. So there are 9 projects listed. As I said, usually no more than 1 or 2 actually end up being able to be started, but the board is asked to give the general manager the authority to start these projects in this year rather than waiting until next year if the staff has the capacity to do so.
Yes.
Toward the top of that list, you have the Alexander Avenue Rehabilitation Design Project. It pops up again way later in the document, like page 191, I think it is, and with a little later timeline than given here. We have heard an awful lot about Alexander Avenue over the last several months or couple of years, including an editorial, a guest editorial in the Marin Independent Journal by Warren Wells just this last week, I think. And also, I personally received a detailed email from Mr. Wells listing grant opportunities that might be useful for Alexander Avenue. One of the likeliest of which is, one of which seemed to be the likeliest of which was on a biennial cycle, which means that if you hit it right, you could get things done fairly quickly. If you hit it wrong, you could be putting off work that might otherwise be available through that grant much longer than you would like. I would hope that this particular line item could be moved ahead rather than sit where it is at the manager's discretion to move ahead if things are dandy. So I will put that out there.
Thank you. It's been heard.
Yes.
Yes.
Anyone else?
I'll second that.
Okay.
I'll third that.
Very good. Please continue.
Okay, thank you.
With
that
that
sort of sums up the overview. The detail, each and every project is detailed in the budget chapters themselves. So if it's a bridge division project, it is in the bridge division budget chapter in their capital discussion. So each and every one of our projects is discussed, and I urge you, if you're interested in a particular project, please go and take a look at that. And then the last thing I want to point out is those division chapters, and I mentioned this in the very, very, very beginning, which is the district division status. And it's an interesting name, but the division status is really what that division is doing, what they've done. It's their accomplishments, their goals for next year, their work, some of the things they're working on. And each one of your division heads and and department heads have spent time adding their sort of 2 cents to that piece. It's condensed, but it's there, and I think they're all very interesting. So please take a look at those to get an idea of what your actual groups will be doing. And I'm sorry we don't have time to cover them all in this particular discussion. With that, I'd like to turn back to the board item very shortly, and that's on the first page, and it's page 43 of your packet, of this day's Finance Auditing Committee packet. And just to remind you that there are 5 recommendations that the Finance Committee will be asked to make to the board next meeting. The first one is to authorize the district goals, project accomplishments. That's those status reports. The reserve structure, which we talked about in this overview. Changes to the table of organization we just went through. The next one includes the salary increases will be included for coalition non-rep, but in this case, the report says not for the ATU, but that could change tomorrow or in the coming weeks, depending on what happens with the ATU's settlement discussions and with their members. The next third recommendation is it includes a capital contribution of $21 million, and that funds your reserves, and that's something we mentioned in the overview. It authorizes budget increases for these 5 capital projects. Those are the 5 that I went over. That totals $785,000. And then lastly, number 5, and we mentioned the first one of these. These are authorizes the following items that are currently not included in the proposed budget, but will be included in the adopted budget. That's the one that you would vote on the 30th. And those are any board action that occurs between now and June 30th. So if you do something at one of your meetings or you settle a contract, we'll include that in the budget. That allows us to carry over any incomplete project. We tried to do that already in this, but sometimes we didn't know, and a project we thought was going to be completed may not be completed. We'll need to carry that over. To move any capital projects on the 25-24 list, and that was, for example, a project that was just managed by our president. Would that be moved up to the budget? This would allow the general manager to do that. And then lastly, to include any final budget transfers. As you know, next month we have a budget transfer report to comply with the rules of the board. If there's any final ones that need to be made, we will include those based on the first or second accounting close. We will include those in the adopted book that you will receive at your August board meeting. And with that, I am done and will have to answer any other questions that you might have.
Noting that we will not be taking action on this today, but we're just looking at what kind of action we'll take next month. Are there questions for Mr. Wire here? We exhausted our questions in the course of his presentation already.
Oh, one more.
Oh,
I
there's
assume,
Mr.
page 43, number 2, and I assume that's taken care of, which is salaries increase for ATU represented employees to be negotiated.
I think that's what he was just saying, that that will be included if we and the bargaining unit approve those
Right.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Correct.
The bargaining unit approves it whenever it approves it. Yeah. Director Rodani.
Yeah, maybe more of a comment. I guess, Joe, I'm looking at a budget with a $55 million deficit, but the narrative I'm hearing from you is that it's more likely like the 20 million from the current year estimated. that we're looking at. I think there's a level of comfort in that the glide path will work for us, with understanding that.
I think if that's really a policy decision by this board. In other words, and by the full board, of course. You're giving essentially the budget the authority to spend more, and the direction of the general manager back to you and the staff back to you saying, look, if the customer demands more, we plan to step up to offer that demand. However, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that they haven't been demanding a great deal more, just a little bit more each year. So that's our expectation. So I think what you're saying is sort of summarizing that. If for some reason any of those assumptions were to change, of course, we would be talking to you each and every board meeting. You would know, and the general manager always puts in his GM report if there's any change to the service, if I added a trip or that goes in there. So you'll know if we start seeing a lot of that going on, and I'll be raising the flag if we see a change.
I saw they're in a good giant season. Would help.
Could be a good thing too.
Exactly. The use of public transit generally considered in our society a good thing. Yes, definitely.
Breaker Stir is on Sunday.
Anyone else? Then, well, thank you.
We probably do have public comment.
Public comment, yes. I see one possible public comment here. Although I see no one in the room. Shall we take the online public comment?
Let's do that. Justine, are you still with us there?
Yes, we do have one public speaker, and when he's finished, if I could just pull the room again, I would appreciate it. Our first speaker is David Pilpel. David, go ahead.
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
we can.
Excellent. Listen to all of that with rapt attention. So this budget does move the fiscal cliff date to sometime after August 1st, 2024. I do agree and note that there's about $1 million of spending over revenues per week. And so that's something to bear in mind. And I get that out of the general manager's report every month. So I appreciate that information. I wish it were better, but that's what's going on. The strategic financial plan is still very important. And I'm thinking about the presentations that were made at the last board meeting and intend to share thoughts on that in the future. I'll also share a few minor technical issues with staff after the meeting. Thank you very much to Joe, Jennifer Minucci, and the other staff for their work on the budget document, which really stands out for me compared to certain budget documents at other agencies. The district's budget is pretty comprehensive and explains a lot, both to the board, the staff, and the public. The budget, however, does not resolve the ongoing ATU pension plan underfunding, which is still an issue. I don't have the page citation, but that was in there. I appreciate the operating budget impact of capital projects. For each project, it indicates the order of magnitude of impact on the operating budget. So this is helpful to understand the impact of those projects. I don't see anywhere information on vacant positions. Although it may seem harsh, I would actually reduce the authorized position count to more closely, but not exactly match operations. Certainly there are a number of bus driver positions that are vacant and some other positions throughout the organization that was referred to. Just over 15 years ago, this was about a 1,000 person organization. It's now 850-ish on paper, but it's really only about 700 in reality, maybe slightly less. And so I would, think about how to size the organization for that reality. The fundamental question is whether bus and ferry demand ever returns to pre-COVID demand, and that has implications throughout the organization and beyond. So I would continue to have to leave authority with the general manager to increase service and fill positions as needed, but I would really move to somewhere between 700 and 850 for the total authorized position count, because I just think it's completely unrealistic to think that you're going to need 850-ish people by the end of the next fiscal year. Even if ridership rebounds by another 10 or 20% from the current base, that still doesn't get you to 850. I have other thoughts about organizational structure, salary parity, and work between departments, but I won't get into that today. And again, I thank the staff for the presentation and the board for the discussion, and look forward to more in the next month prior to adoption in June. Thanks very much for listening.
And thank you, Mr. Philpell. Ms. Bach, do we have anybody else?
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to poll the room and just check.
Please.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone that has joined us that would like to speak this morning at the Finance Committee meeting? I'm polling for this item and for public comment. Please use * to unmute yourself and let me know. I am not hearing anybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bach. So that is it for this particular item. Well, maybe I'll give you one last chance at Mr. Wire. Nobody's jumping at it. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wire. Next item on the agenda is a closed session. However, before we do go into closed session, to accommodate those of the public who are perhaps willing to comment at this point on items not on the agenda, is there any objection to our taking public comment now? I see none. So, Madam Secretary, Ms. Bach, is there anyone from the public who wants to talk to us now?
We have no additional public comment from this side. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks for everyone for their patience during our meetings. We'll place the public on hold for the duration of our closed session item and return after closed session for adjournment. Attorney Manolius, please take us into closed session.
Thank you, President Terrio. At this time, the Finance Auditing Committee will go into closed session for a conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation under Government Code Section 954-956.9A, for the matter on the agenda listed as Larry Graham versus Golden Gate Bridge District.
No, I didn't. Everybody come back in? No one was here.
Okay.
No one's here.
So, Mr. Manolius, will you take us out of closed session, please?
Thank you, President Terrio. Yes, the Finance Auditing Committee met, as I suggested before, in closed session to just deal with the Larry Graham versus Golden Gate Bridge District matter, and gave the employer appropriate guidance as to how to handle it.
That's it. So the only thing left to us today is a motion to adjourn. Can I have one? I see one over there. Second over there. Anyone against this? We're adjourned. Thank you.